So what I'd like to try to do is look at the breadth of Jesus' character, the broadness of it as detailed here in Philippians. Look at his calling and his mission, because really Jesus' character is defined by why he was coming to the earth. And then the last part, I'd like to look at what we know about Jesus and the way he treated people and the way people reacted to him that tells us what kind of a man he was. All right, so we'll do our best to get through. We won't be able to dwell on anything for an extended period of time. It'll just be more skipping over each thing to build a bigger picture. So in Philippians, we get an idea of the broadness of Jesus' character, right? The kind of man he was. Now, you notice here it says, "Let this mind be with you, which was in Jesus Christ, who being in the form of God, thought not robbery with God a thing to be grasped at." It's better translated. So even though he was wiser, smarter, more intelligent than any other man, he didn't sort of lift himself up and go, "Well, I want to be just like God because I'm the Son of God." He never pulled rank. He was never entitled in that way. But he made himself of no reputation, and he became a servant. Now in these next verses, think gospel record, what do you find about Jesus that's highlighted in each one of these verses? Think the gospel record, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Can anyone tell me? You might have a highlight in your Bible. He took upon himself the form of a servant. Which gospel deals with Jesus as a servant? You can shout it out if you like. Immediately, straightway, he did this, he did this. The Gospel of Mark, right? And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself, so he presents him as the Son of Man. The Gospel of Luke. Wherefore God has highly exalted him, so he presents Jesus as the eagle, right? The lofty mind, raised up with God. No man has ascended to heaven, but the Son of Man who is in heaven. Nicodemus, I'm there with God right now, in my mind, not like you. That at the name of Jesus every knee should bow. So once again we have the King. So in Philippians we have the breadth of Jesus' character. He was a servant. He was a Son of Man. He was a listening ear. He was a compassionate person. He touched people. He healed people. He listened to people. Right? He was also somebody who did the work. Right? He went about doing good. He was a practical person. But he was also an exciting person to be around. He could tell an amazing story. He could enthrall people with his words. And he was in his elevated mind. You know, all through John's gospel, you get this sense Jesus is talking at one level and they're not understanding him at all. Like his disciples, the Pharisees, they got just grasping a little bit about what Jesus is saying. His mind was operating at a different level. Now, when we look at ourselves, brothers and sisters, we are generally quite limited people. How many characteristics does God have? Well, we have mercy and truth. And in God, mercy and truth kisses one another. God, the balance is perfect in God. But when you find somebody who is a little bit more strict, a little bit more upright, a little bit more logical, and someone who is more soft and compassionate, generally there's a lot of areas where those two will clash on how things should be done and how people should be handled and how problems should be solved. Mercy and truth don't always kiss one another. But in Jesus Christ, he was, as Colossians chapter 2 says, it says, in him dwells the fullness of the Godhead bodily. So he was the breadth of God's character in a man. So whereas you and I, we start out as a Matthew or a Mark or a Luke or a John, Jesus was all of those things. He was the perfect reflection of God. He was, as he said, the way, the truth and the life. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so when we look at the four Gospels, we find that science and philosophy and human science have looked at this idea of personality types. And of course, large corporations use this a lot to work out the dynamic of the workplace. But the Greeks were playing around with this as well. Phlegmatic, based upon bile, blood, and all these things, all these bodily fluids, basically. But that was essentially the four characteristics of people. Right? They recognise that people, broadly speaking, are one or the other, or they can grow into another if they like. And here is Lithuania's most famous church, Catholic. And what do we find in the Gospel records? Well, there's the ox, that's Matthew. There's the lion, Mark, this is Matthew. Here is the Luke. And here is John, the eagle. Okay? So again, this is not a new idea. Jesus was all of these things, right? For me, I looked at the personality type. I did a test, obviously, and I found it very interesting. And then I looked at the personality type that I thought would most annoy me, and I would more than likely most annoy that person. And my wife did the same test, and she turned out to be that person. I thought, I hope I'm not bothering you too much, love, but after 16 years, I guess we've kind of worked things out. But it's healthy, it's good. You end up with somebody that challenges you. You realise that you're not the full picture. We're limited. We have something to offer the world, but we're not the fullness of the Godhead bodily. And other brothers and sisters fill those roles, and together we reflect Jesus Christ. That's what the cherubim is all about. That's why there's 4 faces on the cherubim. But in Christ, he was all of those things. And so just reflecting what Paul says. Paul was Jesus Christ of the Gentiles. So he was a very developed character. And he said, look, to the Jews I became like a Jew that I might win Jews over. And to those without law, well, I could relate to them too, so I could win them. He said, I wasn't lawless. I wasn't running around breaking the law, but I could relate to people. He says, to the weak I became as weak that I might gain the weak. I made all things to all men that by all means I might save some. Now that was what Paul was like. Jesus Christ was more so. He could relate and connect to everybody at every level. So Nicodemus turns up, Jesus has a rapport. A publican rocks up, Jesus can connect with that person. A widow, the sick, Jesus was able to connect with everybody. Whereas I think you'll find, if we're honest with ourselves, there's some people we're very comfortable with, then other people come along. You don't know what to talk about. There's lots of awkward silences. You're like, yes, well, how's work? And it gets very, very awkward because we don't naturally relate to all kinds of different people. There are some people we just don't gel with. Jesus never had that problem. He could relate to everybody. So what do we know about Jesus' mission? Because really, he came to do a job. Jesus wasn't born into the world to be a gardener or do a normal job. He had a specific purpose, and obedience to God was the fulfillment of that mission. And when we come to John's record, John throws us up this great big picture, and he introduces the idea of the word or the logos, right? And if you look at what logos means, logos is an idea which means a declaration and intent, something that has meaning, but something that also has logic. So the word logic comes from logos. Logic are ideas that make sense. And logo also relates to logos. A logo is not words, it's a symbol, it's a representation. It's something that you look at, but it has meaning, it makes sense. So logos is this very, very broad word that encompasses all of those things. Right? It's a declaration, it's purpose, it's meaning, it's all of these things. And so John throws us right back into this big picture. He goes, in the beginning there's this purpose and intent. So the kingdom of God is the kingdom prepared before the foundation of the world. And so in the beginning there was a plan. There was logos, there was purpose and intent. Logos was with God and it was God. So how was God logos? Well, God's name is He Who Will Be. God's name is a logos. It's a declaration of intent. Then it says, well, all things were made by logos. So when people look in the universe, they find that there is laws, there is energy, there is matter, there is mathematics. Things work and you can predict things that you can't even see. There's logos, there's purpose, there's a mind out there. It says in logos there was life. So when people go to DNA, they find it's a code, there's information, it's a declaration of intent. And then enlightenment, right? So the light of God. So in morality, we find that people all over the place, whether they believe in God or not, know it's good to tell the truth. It's good to show compassion. So there is a logos, there's meaning in morality. And then right the way down, John says, the logos was made flesh and dwelt amongst us. So all of this plan, all of this purpose, all the meaning is focused down in on one man, and that's our Lord Jesus Christ. The Lord Jesus Christ is all of this, that the purpose of everything is because he was born on the earth, which is a massive thing to say. So when we read the Bible, it says, go to the ant, you sluggard, and learn wisdom, and look at the lilies and how they sow, and all these lessons that come out of creation. Well, we can learn about God by focusing on what God has done. And there are lessons that point forward to Christ and the character of God in everything. Right? And so we're told in John chapter 14, the Logos was made flesh and dwelt amongst us. We beheld his glory. The glory is the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Right? And of his fullness we've received grace for grace. For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. It says, no one has seen God at any time, but the only begotten Son has declared God. So what was his purpose? Well, his purpose was to get God, God's character, God's plan, God's intent, God's logos, and live it in a life. Right? Live it in his example, in his words, and his actions. So when people say, well, who is God? What is God all about? They just had to watch him, and they just had to look at him. And so we know there's a number of statements, mostly in John, where Philip said, he says to Philip, how long have you been with me? He says, he that has seen me has seen the Father. How do you say, show us the Father? I am a reflection of my Father. You know, John chapter 10, I and my Father are one. He says, no, I am a reflection of God's words and God's actions. I reflect it, therefore I'm one with God, just like people in the Old Testament were God to whoever they give a message from God. John 17, this is life eternal, that they may know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom thou hast sent. So when Jesus came into the world, where was the apex of the seed of the serpent? Who, if you had one individual that defined the serpent, the seed of the serpent as a system, who would that individual have been in Jesus' time? Who lobbied to get him killed? Pharisees, scribes, and the high priest. Now, when you go to the Old Testament, what was the role of the high priest supposed to be? The role of the high priest was God's representative on earth. He represented the nation to God and God to the nation. And when Jesus comes along, right, reflecting the true God, the number one enemy that ultimately lobbied to get him killed was the very system that God had set up. The seed of the serpent was the priests, the Pharisees, the scribes, the people who were custodians of God's law. And so it gives you an idea of how confused truth had become. People like Zechariah, people like Anna and Simeon, all these prophets and random individuals holding fast to truth. But the system, the infrastructure that God has set up in the Old Testament was utterly corrupted right the way to the top, to the core of the whole system. So people didn't know who God was. And so we read in Galatians, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman. So Jesus came at a time when people didn't know who God was. Very much like Moses, when he had to take those people out of Egypt and teach them who God was. Because they had no idea. They really didn't know. In Jesus' situation, though, it was much more sadder. Because they had a bizarre human form of religion that resembled nothing what God had in mind. So they thought that they were children of Abraham. They thought that they were sons of Moses. They thought that they had this status, this prestige. But it was a lie. It was a joke. It wasn't religion. It was total hypocrisy. And so when Jesus came manifesting the truth, he was a foreigner. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know where he's come from. They didn't know what motivated him. And so you had this very strange thing, and John picks it up. He said he came into the world knew him not. He came to his own, and his own didn't even know him. He said, but those that did know him, he taught them how to be sons and daughters of God. And so Jesus really was declaring God's character, and in so doing, showing a clear distinction between two ways of thinking, two ways of living, and two ways of acting. And so I've got this idea, the human morality spectrum. Human beings are very strange creatures. We're made in the image and likeness of God. We're made able to reflect glory and honour. We can comprehend what God has revealed. Other animals can't. Right? We are in a very special place. We're made in the image and glory of God. But we are also no different from any other animal. And so Romans 1 says that the moment people deny God, they become animals. There's no halfway. You're either trying to reflect God's virtues. The moment you do that and you exchange the glory away, you become just like the animals. And then, of course, Romans 1 talks about the morality that people manifest. And so, Jesus came to show the benefit, the goodness of God, because the message that he gave was so totally counterintuitive, because the systems that the scribes and Pharisees had built were basically dog packs. They were animal kingdoms. They were hierarchies. They were ladders. And these infrastructures that had nothing to do with spirituality and everything to do with the glorification of human pride and flesh. So when Jesus came, you had on the one hand the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, all the individuals like Herod, Pilate, the Romans, and they all had their animal-like infrastructures, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. So Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night. He is a master in Israel. He has reached the top. He is a title amongst men, and he has worked all his life to achieve that title. And Jesus says to him, you've got to become like a proselyte. So when he plays dumb and he says, how can a man be born again? He knew exactly what Jesus was saying. When they converted proselytes, they said to them, you've been born again, and they baptized proselytes. He knew what Jesus was saying, but he thought, surely I have attained this enormous height in Israel. I have this title, the master. And you're telling me I've got to be like a proselyte? You're telling me this is all a waste of time, that this work that I've done, sitting in all these men's feet and climbing way out this ladder, is just an animal construct. It's not of God. And that's exactly what Jesus was telling him. You've got to start again. You've kind of wasted your life. And Nicodemus, as we know, he took 3 years to convert. You imagine getting to the ripe old age of 60, 70, however old he was, and realising that everything you've laboured for has been a total waste of time. And you've now got to start again. And Paul says it in Philippians very, very eloquently. He says, I count it all but dung. Right? So it's quite blunt, rather crude, but that's how Paul esteemed it. He just said, everything that I worked and strived for and I valued, this is not what Christ is about. This is not actually what God wanted. So when we look at there's two ways of thinking. We find on the one hand hierarchies, status, the self-focus, the hypocrisy of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, where they'd pray on street corners and they'd contort their faces, and everything was about, watch me, look at me, am I not a wonderful person? They had these elaborate uniforms. And Jesus shone a very stark light on that and showed people how it was a total waste of time. And it was about ladders, who's better than who has a higher status, who deserves to sit in that chair, who only deserves to sit in that chair. Dominating other people, right? It says, Paul mentions about these people who lifted themselves up and they were worshipped by others. Even when they slapped people in the face, they go, oh, hit me again, I think you're amazing. Scribes and the Pharisees were like that. They dominated people that they felt were less than them. It was all a dog pack. It was like a dog pack, nothing different. You look at the way a dog pack acts, and you've got the alpha male, and he's the biggest, strongest dog. He gets all the privileges. What they had built out of the law of Moses was the same base core motivation, operating on the same basis of pride, right? Entitlement, but underneath it all, there was this insecurity. There was this fear of falling, this fear of not being noticed, this fear that they had where people wouldn't think of them like they wanted to be thought of. And Jesus offered something totally different. It was so counterintuitive. It was based upon service and humility. It wasn't focused on you or your neighbour as a measure. Paul talks about measuring ourselves by ourselves. Jesus said, well, I'm the focus, right? You are all brothers, right? I don't want any of you calling one another father or anything like that. If you're going to worship or acknowledge a superior, it's me. But all of you are to serve one another. And the one you value the most is not valued because he's richer or he has more stuff or whatever. He is valued and respected because he serves more than anybody else. The hardest worker, the most compassionate person, The one that serves others is the one to be respected. It was completely on the head of what the scribes and Pharisees had done. It was based upon sacrifice and love, but the end result that Jesus was offering was something that would give them a sense of peace. And we'll go into that a little bit later on. Now, I won't talk about that, but I just sat down one day and thought all the things we have in common with animals, and the only thing that God's given that allows humans to be different, right? And obviously there's a lot we share in common with the animals. If you've got a pet dog, you'll find that dogs are playful, jealous, bored, fearful, curious. They get sick. You can joke with an animal. They sort of know they're being teased. But there's certain things that only humans can do because it allows us to connect with God. It allows us to be different. And they're all things that take effort. We've got to go to school, university, or read our Bible and examine ourselves. Whereas all the other stuff comes naturally. It's just part of who we're born with. But when you look at Jesus' message, we're confronted with the fact that we as people are really two states in one, aren't we? We know in baptism that there's an old man and then there's Christ. And so we're told that we share a lot in common with the animals. The heart is deceitful and desperately wicked. Have the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. We're born unto trouble as the sparks fly upwards. Our righteousness is filthy rags. If God should mark perversity, who would stand? And a wretched man that I am, says Paul, who shall deliver me from this body of death? So on the one hand, Jesus came in a body of flesh. He knew what it was like to be tired and burdened and all the problems of life. People could relate to him and he could relate to others. But then all of us, don't we, have the ability to be better. We're created in the image and likeness of God. God made man upright, says Ecclesiastes. We're made a little lower than the angels. We are crowned with glory and honour. Humans have potential to be like God, and they have potential to be just like animals. God put all things under our dominion. It says, man who is honour, we abide not. We're just like the beasts that perish, even though we have this exalted state. And Paul says, well, I delight after the law of God, after the inner man. And Paul talks about this struggle in him. There's part of him that loved to keep God's law and enjoyed this elevated state of mind. But then he had this wretched body that dragged him down. And so what Jesus was saying is that there is a whole lifestyle around there, which while it's counterintuitive, while it doesn't make sense to somebody who is living a life of flesh, it actually, when you think about it and you do it, it brings forth a certain state of peace. Okay? And so when he was dealing with his disciples, and I had his disciples earlier, they oscillated. We see it very clearly, that the disciples spent a lot of time arguing about who was better than who's going to sit on my right hand or left. Though all men betray you, Jesus, I, says Peter, won't betray you. They swung between these two states of mind, right, where they measured themselves by themselves. And Jesus constantly is showing that there is another way, and it's highly counterintuitive if your mindset is fleshly, but it actually works to bring about peace. And so in Luke, we read there that they were fighting about who was going to be the greatest. And Jesus says, look, there's this great big ladder of hierarchy. There's this huge hierarchy in the world. The kings exercise lordship over them, and they'll exercise lordship over them. And there's this great big ladder from the least to the greatest. And he says, but it will not be so with you, right? But whoever is the greatest, let he be the one that is the best servant. Let he be the one that serves. And he says, if you want the example, look at me. I'm here serving you. I'm here looking out for your needs. And Jesus reinforced this with the washing of the feet. Now, we won't go into it, but you remember, no one's going to touch one another's feet in that room because they're all arguing about who was going to be better than who. And by the measure of flesh, washing feet is lower than the person who gets his feet washed. So that's how the ladder of life is measured. So none of them are going to touch one another's feet. So when Jesus does it, Peter's there, well, Jesus, you're not going to touch my feet. You know, I know who you are, Jesus, but these people don't know who you are and they've let you touch their feet, but I know you're better. You will never touch my feet because I know who you are. And Jesus says, well, Peter, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part of me. And he says, oh, well, you better wash hands and face as well. Wash the whole lot, because they've only had their feet washed, but I want all of my body washed so I can say that I'm better than them. And you look at what Jesus says. He says, Peter, what I do you don't know, you don't understand. But one day you all will. You'll all see the value of actually living a life where you're not worried by earthly measures. You're not insecure about who's better than who. You actually have your own character, your own role in the truth. You follow Christ, not other people. You're not measuring and comparing all the time, and you're actually free from this way of thinking. But he said to Peter, at the moment, you don't know, but one day you will. And right at the very end, Peter says to John, what about this man? What shall he do? How's John going to die? And Jesus says, just follow me, Peter. Don't you worry. You just focus on feeding my sheep. And remember that comment that Jesus says to Peter in the context of all of this left side and right side of who was going to be greatest. And he turns to Peter and says, Peter, Satan's going to sift you like wheat, but I pray that you'll have strength. And he says, but when you're converted, strengthen your brothers. And when you think about it, brothers and sisters, if we are constantly worried by rivalry and competition and proving a point to other people, are you going to strengthen those who are your competition? In a workplace where you see this rivalry between these two people, do they strengthen one another? Of course not, because they'll give one the advantage over the other. It's a competition. They'll do everything to slam that person down. But when you're focused on Christ, when you know your place in the ecclesia and you're not trying to prove anything, well, we're all working to a higher cause. The cause is greater than all of us. And Jesus is really the one we're measuring ourselves against, and none of us really are a fullness of Jesus. And so we're all working together. We actually need one another, and therefore the idea of strengthening your brother is not a bad thing because we get the job done, and it's not about us. So Jesus says this comment to Peter. He says, when you are converted, strengthen your brothers. And he'd been following Jesus for 3 years. But he says, no, while you think like this, you're not converted. While you're measuring and comparing and insecure and all this jealousy carrying on, you are not converted. You're just like the animal kingdom. No different. Now, what about turning the other cheek and the coat and the cloak and walking the extra mile? Now, once again, if you're in a fleshly state of mind, who likes the idea of someone going smack and then pop, smack? You just sort of sit there and getting beaten up. And if someone demands my coat, I'm already annoyed that they're making demands. Am I going to give my cloak as well? You think, well, no, I tell them to go away, leave me alone. If someone's going to push me to walk a mile, why would I walk 2? So in the fleshly state of mind, it's just great. If someone hits you, the first inclination is, I'm going to give you one back. Or we've heard the joke, I've only got 2 cheeks to turn, and then after one, I'll give you one. But what's the mindset that Jesus is talking about? It's counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense to the natural man. Well, let's have a look at the walking the extra mile and the coat and the cloak. So someone comes up to you and they're starting a conflict. In all these things, the conflict is being imposed upon you. Someone's trying to get you to do something. Now, why do people start conflicts? People do conflicts to control your reactions. Why does a dog start a fight with another dog? To work out who's dominant. That's why humans start conflicts. They have these little points of comparison, these little things where they'll try and, if you submit, I'm better than you. If you don't submit, well, we've got to have it out. And it's all about measuring where you're at. So look at Jesus' advice here. The man that comes along and says, you're going to walk a mile with me. What's he expecting? He's expecting someone to say no. Now he knows he's got opposition. Or if he goes, okay. Well, now he knows that he's submissive. And so he knows where they are in the status ladder of life. That's why most people at work start fights, because that's what they want to reinforce. But when you go along and say, well, yeah, I'll walk a mile with you. Hey, look, while we're walking, do you want to walk another mile? I'm happy to walk another mile. Do you want to walk more? Now, that is not submission or resistance. That is another thing altogether. That is something that person is not expecting. He's not expecting you to offer another mile. He only wants the one. He wants to get that out of you. So the moment you do something different, he's just like, hang on. He's not scared of me. He's complying with me, but he's not because he thinks I'm better. He's just cooperating. And the same with the coat and the cloak. Someone demands your coat. What do they want? They either resist or submit. They want to know where they fit. And you say, sure, have my coat. Oh, by the way, the cloak's matching. Do you want that too? You're showing that person that they have no control over your movements, that you are a free person in Christ, that you are owned by somebody else, that no one can control your reactions. Now, did Jesus put that into practice? Absolutely. When you come to the end of Jesus' life, he heals the blind man. And the Pharisees front up to the parents. They go, is this your son? They go, yes, it's our son. And they're terrified. They're absolutely terrified of excommunication. And so they knew, they were scared. They were weighing their words and they were all stuttering and careful about how they answered. But when Jesus is before them and they're threatening him and they're saying all these things, he didn't say a word. They could not get him to bite. They couldn't get him to react defensively. They couldn't get him to defend himself. He just completely chilled out. And the same with the disciples, when they would get hauled up before the very men that killed Christ. But now they know that Jesus is risen. Nothing can touch them. And they stand there and they say, we have to do God's will. And they're calm. They're not intimidated. They're not scared. And so on the one hand, you think, why would you do that to a person that's pushing you around? But on the other hand, once you get into that godly state of mind, you can see the wisdom. And it's the same as what Paul says. When it says your enemy hungers, give him meat, and when he's thirsty, give him drink. You'll heap coals of fire on his head. It's the same rationale. Is the enemy expecting you to help him? No. He's in a weak position. He expects you to hit him down harder. You've now got him. He's exactly where you want him. Get him. The last thing he's expecting is for you to help him. And when he goes home that night, when you've given him food and drink, his brain is going like this, because he cannot work out why, when you had him exactly where you wanted him, you did all those wonderful things. That's the counterintuitive way that Christ is teaching. And this is why so many Pharisees and Sadducees had no idea what he was saying. They just thought, this is bizarre. Why would you even do that? Because he was preaching another way of thinking. And so things like the first shall be last and the last shall be first. When we run around, the way God set it up, we have all these strengths and abilities. We have all these things we can do in God's service. If you use that to dominate other people, you feel a sense of power. But it doesn't last, and then you feel like you feel slightly guilty. You feel like you've done something slightly wrong. But if we serve others, and we genuinely give it our time and our energy, and we use our abilities in the service of others, God has set this whole thing up that we feel peace. We feel a certain assurance. We know we've done the right thing. And in the world, they talk about practice random acts of kindness. Why? Because it happens to them too. When people out there are volunteers and they give, they sacrifice, they realise that my life is so much happier than when I was just in it for myself. That's why all these millionaires become philanthropists in the end. They give all their money away because they get to the top and they realise, well, gee, I spent all my time chasing what I thought would make me happy. None of it did. And when I give money away, it makes me happy. I'll give money away or I'll save the dolphins or whatever they do. So at the end of their life, they realise that, that actually makes me feel better. God set the human condition up in such a way that everything Jesus was teaching, when men stumble upon it, self-sacrifice, standing for truth, showing mercy, compassion, being a servant. When humans stumble upon it, they go, oh, that felt good. Maybe I should do this more often. Right? And this is the way God has set up human nature. That yes, human nature is natural, but when we do God's character, when we live it, we actually feel better about ourselves. And Jesus was there to show those two ways of thinking. Right? Nicodemus is a classic example where he goes around Nicodemus like a potato peeler. The man comes as a rabbi, master in Israel, and Jesus basically says you have to start again. He speaks in a way that Nicodemus doesn't understand. He says to Nicodemus, you don't understand what I'm saying, and you're a master in Israel? So Nicodemus, I'm speaking about the wind, and I'm speaking about spiritual people. How are you going to cope if I start talking about spiritual things? That's natural stuff. And you're struggling to cope? And then at the end he says, Nicodemus, do you know why people come at night? People roam around in the night because they know deep down that their works will not stand the light of day. Have a good night. And he sends him on his way. It's brutal what he does to him, but it's very nice and genteel. But he strips away all of his layers. And it worked. Come the next chapter, to the woman of Samaria, and he just talks about drinking water. Completely different message. Completely different approach. He could connect with anybody. As John says, he didn't need anyone to tell him what was in men. He knew what was in men. So what I would like to do now is just spend the last 15 minutes looking at what kind of person Jesus was. If you met him, what kind of a man was he? And I want to have a look at a couple of things which the world does. One is Jesus of Nazareth. It's a very brief section, based in 1977. Right, and this is how Jesus was popularly perceived back then. So here we go. It's only a minute. The disciples are anguished.
Master, you should send these people away. We've got nothing to give them to eat. They should go to the villages where they can find food.
There's no need to send them away. You give them something to eat.
So there Jesus, and all the way through it, 6 hours, it's a very famous Life of Jesus thing. He's this blue-eyed, ethereal person that sort of floats above everybody. And as you can see, there's people crying and the disciples are all worried and he's just like, wow, in some other place, right? And that's how Jesus was portrayed. And it's a very Catholic view of Jesus, that he was distant, that he was aloof, he was a special person, and therefore he didn't bog in with other people. So all the kids are crying and people are all hot and bothered and he's just like, wow, somewhere else. And so now here's another one. It's more recent, and it's actually one that I've seen with the family.
Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye, you hypocrites?
Now, that's called the Gospel of Matthew. You can get it in Koorong Bookshop. And I strongly recommend it. That DVD series completely altered my perception of Jesus. Obviously, you've got to be careful of any portrayal of Jesus, because for what we said earlier, that no human can completely manifest Jesus' character. But when you look at that series, it's just Gospel of Matthew read. There's word for word out the NIV. But yeah, he touches people, he hugs people, he engages. When he's talking to his disciples and he says, let him be as the tax gatherer. Matthew, the tax gatherer, is there and he goes, and they sort of all rough him up and everything. And it's a very real and organic way. And it's just one of those things, you look at it and at first you sort of confront it. And you think, it's a bit strange. Yeah, Jesus gets right down with the people. But then you think, well, that's what he did. He actually touched the untouchable. That's the kind of person he was. And so it's good to ask ourselves, well, what kind of a man was he? Was he the wow person, Or was he somebody that if he caught your eye, he would smile at you? He'd give you a nod? Now, what kind of person was Jesus as a character, as an individual? And we do get a lot of passages in the Bible that talk about it. One thing is that the publicans and the sinners. Now, these are people. Now, you get anybody with a lot of personal problems, a scandal in their life, something really terrible, and they're a marked person. They are highly sensitive. They know people are judging them. They know people are looking down on them. They know that people are spitting in their direction or walking to the other side of the street. They become very, very sensitive people. And the publicans were like that. Yes, they were rich, but they were utterly despised. Now, these people came to him. They heard he was in an area. They knew that he would welcome them. He would accept them. He would talk to them. He would meet their eye. He wouldn't sort of like, oh, you're a tax gatherer. I see. Right, well, getting lots of money then. He wasn't like that. He accepted them and embraced them and talked to them about God. Showed them the good news. And they came to him. Now, the one with the Samaritan woman, the Syrophoenician woman, is very interesting because she had the disciples saying, send her away, Lord, send her away. And she's used to Jewish prejudice. She knows that Jews hate her and she didn't like the Jews, that the Jews were snobs and they looked down on Gentiles. But when Jesus looks her in the eye and he goes, it's not right for us to give the children's bread and cast it to dogs. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her know, I should push this issue because he's different. He's not like those disciples who hate me. He's testing me. And there was something in her eyes that kind of allowed her the confidence to push on and give her response. Yes, Lord, but the children eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And exactly the same with the woman of Samaria. Now, she had 5 husbands. She was obviously a fairly attractive woman. You don't pick up 5 men and a 6th with being an unattractive person, right? So she's used to men saying, hey, can I have a drink? She's used to men leering at her. She's used to men looking at her. She's used to the attention of men. But this man says, can I have a drink? And she looks him up and she sizes him up and she immediately knows that this man is not no ordinary man. He's not after me. He doesn't want me in that sense that all those other men wanted her. And he actually wants to engage in a conversation. And he's a Jew. He's clearly a Jew, so technically he should hate me. And yet he wants to talk to me. And everything about Jesus' face reassured her that this man was genuine and he actually wanted to talk. So she said, well, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, being a woman of Samaria? And the other one, which I love, it's an amazing miracle. Because I think it says so much about Jesus. You get into these arguments about what Jesus can and can't do and what he will and won't do. This leper comes up to him and he goes, Jesus, if you will, you can make me clean. And he goes, I will be clean. It's as simple as that. There's no terms and conditions. There's no, did you go to the synagogue? How have you done? And look, if I do this, you've got to do that. He says to him, if you will, you can make me clean. Yes, I will be clean. Now, when it says he put forth his hand and touched him, this is a leper. The word touch, if you look it up in the Greek, is to grasp hold of. So he didn't just go, all right, leper, you're clean, as most people would if they ever had to touch a leper. He actually grabbed his face. So he actually put his hand forward and grasped his face. Probably the first human being that ever done that to him. So he wasn't scared to touch the untouchable. But it's just an amazing thing, that there's people came up to Jesus and they asked him to do things for them, and he did things for people simply because he cared. No other reason. No other reason. We had a bunny, and our bunny died about 4 years ago. And the boys were, saying, will God raise the bunny from the dead? And I said to them, look, the bunny wasn't baptised, so God doesn't have to raise anybody from the dead if they're not baptised. I said, but Jesus was a very nice man who did lots of nice things for people because they asked him. So why don't you ask Jesus for a special favour for Bunny? I said, and if he says no, I'm sure he'll have a very good answer for you. And it was after we watched that, and I thought, well, that's a fair answer. He did so many things simply because he cared. He was a kind person. He was a nice person. He was there to show that God is a father. Now, moving along, Jesus and children. Now, this is an amazing thing. It says he took a child, he set him in the midst, and when he'd taken him in his arms, he said and taught them a lesson. So the child came to him, he picks up the child and gives the child a hug and then gives this lesson. Now, you know there's certain people, like teachers. We all remember the teacher that sort of walked through the hallway and had this very strict look on their face, and it was designed to strike terror in the children's hearts, and it worked. The children are like, whoa, there's that strict, nasty teacher. Right? And they're terrified of the strict one, and the look, they had everything to sort of impose this fear. But then there's another look which children will gravitate for, the open face, the smile. Now, they've done all these scientific experiments and they show a little infant faces and they'll pick the open face, they'll pick the smiling face. Kids loved Jesus. They wanted to be with him. They wanted him to pick them up. He had that open face. He obviously had a very easy smile. He obviously engaged with children at their level. And of course, there's no surprise because he was the fullness of the Godhead bodily. He was a man that could talk to a Pharisee about the law, and then the moment a kid was there, he says, hello, love, how are you? He could do that sort of thing. He was that kind of person. And another one, which is classic, he's very, very tired. He's just heard of John the Baptist's death. He just wants time out, but all these people need help. And he's sorry for them. And he puts his own plans on hold because he needed time out because his own cousin's dead, and he heals a whole lot of them. Right? The other one is Lazarus. Now you think about it. If it was me and I was about to raise a man from the dead and people are weeping, and I'm like, I'm going to pull the best party trick ever. You know, these people are crying now, but Jesus, wait 2 minutes time, I'm going to boom, and he's out the grave and they're all going to be happy again. I wouldn't cry if it was me because you know what you're going to do, and you're sort of like, I'd be excited about that. But Jesus, he saw all these people and he just connected with people at that level and he was moved. Even though he knew exactly what he was going to do, he was moved. He felt this compassion. You just think, well, flip, you did it for those people. How much compassion can a man feel? Because if he had that level of sensitivity, he must have felt a lot of things all the time. And he did. He was that kind of person. And then the other one is Judas. He said, whoever I kiss, the same as he, hold him fast. But what it tells you is that kissing Jesus was not an unusual thing. People hugged him. John leant on him. Judas kissed him. So he was very familiar with his disciples. Remember, Peter was comfortable enough to go up to Jesus and go, you will not go up to Jerusalem. I won't let it happen. And then Jesus says, get you behind me, Satan. There was a familiarity with him and his disciples which allowed that kind of contact to happen. He was a very warm man. Last thing, Jesus' sense of humour, right? Which, of course, very much appeals to me. Now, what's that? It's a picture of a what? It's a whited sepulchre. And he looks at the Pharisees preening themselves, you know, and all these things which are all the outward appearance, and he goes, you're just whitewashing a sepulchre. That's all you're doing. So it's like a man scrubbing his own gravestone. And you look at the irony of that. Like it's a funny thing to say. Like they had all this measure of these things that they'd wear and these phylacteries and prance around looking like $1 million. And everyone goes, oh, that's so spiritual. That's amazing. And Jesus is like, no, you're just scrubbing your grave. That's all you're doing. And that gravestone looks really, really white. But there's such an irony there that it's very, very funny. We saw the speck in the eye. Now, you can't tell that picture. As you saw in the video, they laughed. People laughed. It's a funny picture. The same one with the son. I mean, how many fathers would say, well, I'll give you a snake instead of a fish? You know, we had a prize giving on that recently where we had the parables of Jesus, the ones that were amusing. And they're funny. They're designed to elicit a smile. And then, of course, we all know what that is. The blind leading the blind is funny. It's a funny thing. You picture it, and it's hilarious to picture because, of course, these two people staggering around and they all fall in the ditch. And there's this note of irony, like a person who strains at a gnat. So in the one area of his life, he's so fastidious, and he will slice and dice and slice and dice. And then the other ear just swallows this great big camel. And you just think, that is funny. It was designed to get people to laugh, to see the irony of the whole situation, that the Pharisees had built this ridiculous infrastructure, and none of it was of God, none of it was real, and you could drive a truck through their real spirituality, but they'd slice and dice their herbs and spices and get the exact measurements. And it was all very, very silly. My brothers and sisters, this brings us to the end of the character of Jesus. I hope we've sort of seen the broad depth of Jesus, the kind of character he was, his mission, what he was there to show. God as a father to a world that had totally lost sight of what God was, and the way, of course, he engaged and connected with other people. What I'd like to do is just throw this up as well, because I think how we connect with Jesus and God is something which obviously will determine how we treat each other and how we treat ourselves, really. Now, I remember when I was very young, we were in a youth group committee meeting, and there was this one particular person, and they were organising so many events and activities. And in the end, someone else on the committee said to them, "Why are you trying to cram the year so full? When do people get time with their families? When do they get time to do other things?" And the comment was, well, if we don't fill up the year, young people will end up in nightclubs. So we have to organise more things to keep our young people away from nightclubs. Now, as you can see, the default person, that person's view on human nature was that if you don't have your foot on someone's neck and be pushing them in the right direction, they'll leap over there. They'll just, by default, they'll just become a nightclub person. And then you've got other people that are sort of like, well, the love of Christ and freedom in Christ, we don't want rules, we don't want anything like that at all. And of course, they think that this is only where we are, and they sort of almost disagree that we've even got these bad sides to us. And so they end up with this very liberal, licentious kind of thing, where anything goes. I am free in Christ, I can do whatever I like. And of course, Paul dealt with all of those arguments and debates. The question is, where is our default? When we raise our children, do we treat our children like that strict schoolmistress, that unless I keep my foot on your neck and you're in a constant state of fear, you will turn into wild animals? Or there's other teachers that seem to get all the kids to love them, but the kids know that if they mess with them, the teacher can be quite strict. So it seems that one or the other is not healthy, but mercy and truth, when we develop it, actually is the best way to go. Now, I'll just bring this up, which is, of course, how we relate to God. Now, you look at the parable of the talents. The one-talent man said, well, God's unreasonable. God reaps where he doesn't sow. Right? He's a hard man. Luke says an austere man. So he says, it doesn't matter what I do, he won't be happy with it. So he just gave up, and he didn't do anything. And he buried it in the ground. Now, God is not like that. God is not an unreasonable God. Jesus came showing that God is a father, and God's building a family, and he wants to make people sons of God and part of his family. And everything fatherhood means to us, that's who God is. Yet if we have a view of God that says, well, I've looked at all my weaknesses and problems, I can't possibly get perfect, God is unreasonable and too hard, we will give up. We will lose hope. And what we're saying is that God expects total perfection. God is not realistic about these things over here. Therefore, there's no point in even trying. Right? But then you look at Paul and what motivated him. Now, Paul killed people. He murdered people. Paul had so much baggage about his previous life, which he knew he was forgiven for. Other people may not have forgiven Paul. He was always mindful that he killed people, and he was very careful of the Jerusalem ecclesia and how he treated them, and obviously the gifts that he gave them. But look at his attitude. It's a very liberated one. He says, I am crucified with Christ. So yes, there is a human nature element that we've got to keep our eye on. We never lose sight of the fact that we're human. Nevertheless I live, but not me, but Jesus lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live in the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And Romans 8, who shall separate us from the love of God? Shall tribulation, stress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword. In all these things, he says, we are more than conquerors. So even though we have our weaknesses, even though we live in a world where there's so many temptations that we will fall, we fall every day, we fall every week, we do things that we would not want anybody to know about because they make us ashamed. And we think things that aren't good. I think all of us here, brothers and sisters, we want to be in God's family. We know that when we do godly things and we're with our brothers and sisters, we're happier, we feel better, we have peace. We want to be in God's chesed, a bit like what's Facey Toporus said. What's the guy's name? Darren Toporus. Where we're in that circle of God's chesed. And yes, we fall and we swing around the place. It was like Romans chapter 7 and 8 says, "O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death?" And then he says, "I thank God through Jesus Christ who gives us a victory." Then he says in chapter 8, there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ. What that means is that we will have our ups and downs and our weeks where we're struggling, our weeks where we bomb out. But we know where we want to be and we know where we're the happiest. And as long as we get up, we keep coming along and we never pretend we're better. We're always honest. We're forgiven. God will cover us. And we need that message, brothers and sisters, because honestly, I've never known an era where we've had so many tailor-made temptations. There's never been an era in history which has thrown so much at our young people, ourselves. We need to get this straight. Otherwise, we are going to be like the one-talent man and just give up and say it's all too hard. God's unreasonable. That is not the message Christ came with. Christ came with a very reassuring message. Come unto me, all you who labour and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. That's what we have to hang on to, brothers and sisters, and that's what we're going to need if Jesus delays his coming.